Forensics are having a great run on TV, but you shouldn't believe everything you see. A real-life forensic psychiatrist is going to take on the tropes. Up next on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tara Straka, forensic psychiatrist and assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at NYU Langone Health. Welcome, Tara. That's a long intro. You're very busy. Netflix has a new drama unfolding called Mindhunter, created by the playwright Joe Penhall, and based on the memoir Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit by John Douglas and Mark Olshaker.
Are criminals born, or are they formed?
Psychopaths are convinced that there's nothing wrong with them, so these men are virtually impossible to study. Yet you have found a way in near-perfect laboratory conditions.
Hello, ladies.
That's what makes this so exciting and potentially so far-reaching.
I can't let these guys rub off on me. The way they view sex.
And women.
It is not our job to commiserate with these people. It is our job to electrocute them.
We can't like everything we do. We're talking to serial killers.
Serial killers.
New terminology.
I'm trying to warn you, your attitude is gonna bite you in the ass.
So young to be ruining people's lives.
What did you do?
You're developing a pattern of behavior that will not sustain you here. Agent Ford, if you leave, I can't help you.
There's no procedural rule book for how to talk to these people.
If any of this is gonna work, we need to talk to more subjects. More!
You want truffles? You gotta get in the dirt with the pigs.
Okay, Tara, this series details the creation in the 1970s of the FBI crime unit that was devoted to getting inside the minds of serial killers and, you know, in an effort to stop crime and predict it. And it makes for amazing TV. But in 2018, does that skew the reality of what a forensic psychiatrist does? And I guess by that I mean, can you personally predict the future?
So it definitely skews what people think I do when they ask my profession and I say I'm a forensic psychiatrist.
And then they say what?
People think that I'm tracking down criminals, hunting killers, and that I can read minds and predict the future, which, as you said, makes for great TV and seems very sexy, but unfortunately is not what most forensic psychiatrists are doing. There are profilers, that is a real thing that does exist. So organizations like the FBI have folks who are dedicated to understanding sort of criminal behavior, behavioral science.
And is a profiler a kind of psychiatrist?
So no, so it would be very rare for a forensic psychiatrist to be a profiler. Those folks usually come out of law enforcement organizations, things like the FBI, where they have agents.
So on TV, all the I'm going to keep saying that, by the way. But on TV, Tara, all the scientists are devoted only to catching the crook. As a doctor, it sounds like you are working with the crooks once they become prisoners. Are you sort of focused on the the rights and maintenance of the prisoners?
So there is definitely a big part of the field of forensic psychiatry that is a treatment portion. So there is a large majority of detainees, people in jail, people in prison, who have mental illness. There are estimates that could be anywhere from 15 to even 60% of a jail or prison population is suffering from some type of mental illness. So there are many forensic psychiatrists who have actually dedicated their careers to the treatment end of things, so working inside jails and prisons and actually treating people for their mental illness while they're there.
If someone suffers from psychosis, he or she is psychotic?
So
What does psychosis mean?
So psychosis generally means that someone's had a break from reality. That could be anything from hearing voices would be a kind of psychosis. Just being simply disorganized in your thinking is part of psychosis.
Uh-oh.
I think you're safe.
Okay.
Delusions, so people who have paranoid delusions that someone's out to get them, people that have grandiose delusions, they believe they're God, believe they're someone special or have special powers. All of that is part of psychosis. Sometimes people believe that they're receiving special messages, things that you and I would experience in the regular day and think it has nothing to do with us. The number of taxis that drove by while you were standing at the bus stop, we may think nothing of it. Someone who's psychotic may think that there is a special message to them. And so these are folks who've had some kind of break with reality. That's a very common symptom, mental illness symptom, that can cause people to be unfit to stand trial or to deal with their legal case. It's also a common symptom that comes up when people are found not guilty by reason of insanity.
Netflix's show Mindhunter is still unfolding as we shoot this, but from what we've seen of it, it does seem like the show is dramatizing actual attempts in the 1970s to understand and codify the sociopathic criminal mind so it can be tracked by the FBI. Do you think those real-life efforts have changed how law enforcement approaches crime?
Well, I think there's always a question or a desire to try to better understand why do people do terrible things, why do terrible things happen, and if we can understand that, can we predict it? Can we intervene before terrible things happen?
Can we understand it? I mean, there's this line from the trailer for Mindhunter where they say,
How do we get ahead of crazy if we don't know how crazy thinks?
Very complicated question. I think, psychiatry is certainly an imperfect science. There's a lot about the mind we know. There's a lot about the mind we don't know. And sometimes we can meet with an individual who's committed a horrible crime and understand what happened, where that came from. We were talking about psychosis. If someone's paranoid and believes someone is truly coming to harm them, someone may act in self-defense. It's not real self-defense, but they may act. That's something that sometimes we can understand and wrap our mind around. I think there's a lot of violence and crime that happens that psychiatry, which really is about mental illness, and mental illness may not be the answer or the reason why someone has behaved badly or violently.
That's interesting, because I think there's a strange, perhaps, sense of comfort in thinking that if someone does something absolutely terrible, we can say, oh, he or she was crazy, right? We don't want to think that a sane and rational person does terrible things.
Right. So in reality, probably about 4% of violent crime is really the result of actual mental illness or mental illness symptoms.
I can do math, and that means 96-ish% of violent crime is not done by people who are mentally ill.
Well, certainly not done by, or not committed simply as a result of symptoms of mental illness. So certainly there are lots of mentally ill folks who are in the criminal justice system, in jails and prisons, and certainly may have committed crimes, not necessarily as a result of their mental illness symptoms. So yes, there's this question of kind of mad versus bad, if you will. And it's a question that I don't think as forensic psychiatrists or psychologists necessarily yet have all the answers to. On TV, it certainly looks that way, as if we perhaps know more, understand more. But sometimes mental illness isn't the answer.
So at what point in the process do you come in? Are you ever, and I probably sound like a breathless TV fan now, are you ever in a room with someone who's committed a heinous crime, talking to him or her, doing therapy and trying to understand why and help him or her?
So yes, so that's definitely part of what I do.
What is that like?
It can be pretty intense at times to kind of sit.
Are you
with
in a room
someone.
alone with someone who's committed a heinous crime?
Sometimes.
Do you feel scared?
Well, if I'm feeling scared, I probably shouldn't be in a room alone. So in part of my hospital work, where we take care of people who are either trying to get well and become fit to deal with their legal case, or people who've already been found not guilty by reason of insanity, I spend time sitting with these folks who have become our patients and providing treatment.
Do they know your name?
They do.
Okay. And do you record your sessions? Is there a recording?
There's not a recording.
Okay.
I certainly take notes as I need to, and that can be for different kinds of documentation.
What do you ask them? Do you ask them about what they've done? Do you ask them about who they are? Where do you start and where do you go?
Yeah. Well, certainly for people who are there who've been found not guilty by reason of insanity and who now are in treatment to help decrease their risk for dangerousness. A big part of what we do is sit and talk about what they did and what happened, and how it got to that point. And for these folks, it's really most often about mental illness being out of control. Often these are folks who have had kind of terrible lives and chronic illness and poor social supports and poor access to care. And to really sit with them and help them understand kind of what role they played in maybe not managing their mental health, not taking care of their mental illness as they should, and then how their mental illness kind of hijacks their mind and causes them to do things that they might not otherwise do.
Have you heard stories of things that most of us couldn't believe?
Well, I actually think...
You talk to people who've murdered people, right?
I do. It's interesting that you asked that question because I think in this day and age, we're so saturated in the media that I'm not sure I'm hearing things that other people haven't heard and
or seen on TV.
Or seen on TV or in some ways desensitized to, kind of as a society. But we do, part of the work is to really sit with those folks and help them understand how does your mental illness take over your mind and lead you to behave in a way that you might not otherwise behave.
Now you spend some time being an expert witness, and that's a term that I think people throw around a lot in TV. What does being an expert witness actually entail?
Often there's a lot of just paperwork involved, and we're writing reports.
On TV, there's no paperwork. In movies, there's no paperwork. You all just look really smart and sexy.
That's right. So in a TV world is wonderful. Everything gets wrapped up in 48 minutes. There's no paperwork for anything.
So there's
the
lots
answers
of
are all
paperwork
clear. There's lots of paperwork. So often forensic psychiatrists are doing evaluations and writing reports, and those reports are submitted to the court. Sometimes a particular question requires that we actually go into the courtroom and present testimony and are cross-examined and answer questions. And that can be for any number of things. That can be for fitness. That can be, again, for if someone is looking to put on a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. Usually forensic psychiatrists or psychologists are involved in what we would call a criminal responsibility report. So trying to really look at, was this the result of mental illness?
Okay, so I'm just drawing on my TV and film watching here. As an expert witness, would you probably be considered friend to the defense who wants you to say, this client is not fit to stand trial or is not guilty by reason of insanity. And if you are an expert witness in a courtroom, do you have a prosecutor trying to sort of discredit your evaluation?
There's always a side that feels that your opinion supports their position and a side that does not. And so that's part of what we do. And when I was training to be a forensic psychiatrist, one of our professors said that, you know, our goal when we get up there is to protect the truth. And I think that that's kind of how I try to approach it, and how I think a lot of forensic psychiatrists try to approach it, is that you want to do your best evaluation, and we're really there to help the court. We're there to use our expertise to help the court answer whatever question it is they're trying to answer about the particular case. And so kind of protecting the truth and being honest about what we see, what we think is happening. And so, but you're right, it can sometimes be contentious and grueling and difficult, and you could be on the stand for a long time.
All right, so you're clearing up a whole bunch of things. You, forensic psychiatrist is not a profiler. This all can take years, months, years, right? You have a lot of paperwork. But what is the most egregious TV mistake or misinterpretation that you've seen when you're watching TV or a film, or you're like, oh, please?
Yeah. I think, well, certainly part of what we've already been talking about, right, this idea that the mentally ill are somehow responsible for kind of most of the violence or most of the egregious acts that go on. I think that's a big misinterpretation. And the insanity defense seems to come up all the time on TV. And in truth, really only about 1% of all cases ever put forward an insanity defense. And then of that, only about a quarter of those are successful.
Wow.
So there's a very small number of people who actually are ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity.
Okay.
And on TV, it seems to happen all the time.
Yeah. All right, can you please break down for us what it actually means to be not guilty by reason of insanity or not fit to stand trial? Yeah, so, I mean, on TV, they seem like they're the same thing.
Right, so two totally different things. Fitness, or having the capacity to deal with your legal case, is really just about understanding that you've been charged, understanding the basics about kind of the courtroom or people in the courtroom, the procedure in the courtroom, and then being able to work with your attorney, being able to kind of help support your defense. And there are lots of those evaluations that go on each year. I think there have been estimates that there are about 60,000 of these evaluations that go on each year in this country. And you know, the bar is relatively low about what people need to be able to do to have capacity to go forward in court. The idea being that you want to give as many people as you can the opportunity to have their day in court and put on a defense. Not guilty by reason of insanity is a much different thing. That's actually someone acknowledging that the crime that they've been accused of is something that they in fact did do, but that they should not be held responsible because it was in some way the product of their mental illness. So the idea being that they either were unable to control themselves or couldn't really know or appreciate what they were doing, or that what they were doing was wrong. And so, as I said earlier, there are lots of mentally ill individuals who are in the criminal justice system, but a very small percentage of the crimes that are committed are actually simply the product of mental illness symptoms.
We've spent our time debunking or clarifying the role of the TV forensic scientist, but one thing is factual. Because of these shows, interest in the field of CSI as a career is exploding. When Karen Soren, Columbia University's director of adolescent medicine, sat where you're sitting just a few months ago, She told us that because of these shows, crime scene investigator is now a top career goal amongst teens. What would you say to someone who wants to get into this field?
Well, I think part of what we've been talking about today is this idea that, certainly everything seems very sexy on TV, but in real life, it's not exactly that way.
You're not walking around blood splatters and black lights, right?
Certainly not.
Okay.
But there are folks who do that, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well for any young person who's getting interested in this. There are lots of different avenues and lots of different roles that are played, and on TV, those roles kind of get blurred, and it's as if everyone's sort of all doing the same thing. The DA and the psychiatrist and the law enforcement agents are all trekking through the crime scenes and doing...
Yeah, but on TV, I feel like the scientists, like you, they get to commandeer the situation and they get to walk in and say, "Get off my crime scene," right? And all the police run out of the room.
Right. So again, not accurate at all, and certainly not accurate from my perspective and my role, which is, right, as a medical doctor, as a psychiatrist, to be on a completely different arm of things. So I think one thing is to really think, for young people, is to think about, well, what aspect of this interests you? Because there are lots of different players. There are law enforcement agents who are really trying to solve crimes. There are sort of basic scientists who do things like work with DNA and work with physicists who understand bullet trajectories and blood spatter patterns. I think there's a lot of opportunity in forensic science for basic scientists, as I said, biologists and chemists and physicists. And pathologists. So I think it's helpful for young people to really think about what part of this interests you. Is it the law? Is it the psychology? Is it the science? And
so how would you suggest classes for a kid to take who's interested in a career in forensics?
So I would say lots of science. There may be opportunities to take law classes or criminology classes, psychology courses on behavior, take some biology, take some science courses like physics and chemistry. See what part of it really interests you. Because again, it's not going to be all sexy the way it is on TV. You have to really kind of love what you do and love the science behind it, because every day you're not going to be in a courtroom with a dramatic ending, having sort of had the aha moment.
When you were in medical school, and as my understanding of medical school, you get to go hold baby, you get to do everything, right? You get to try everything out.
You get to try everything.
When did you decide you wanted not just to be a psychiatrist, but a forensic psychiatrist and deal with people who have committed crimes?
So,
or why did you decide that?
Yeah, so in medical school, I knew that I really enjoyed psychiatry and really wanted to be a psychiatrist. It wasn't until later in my residency training where I had more exposure to forensic psychiatry and what that even was. I think as a medical student, I probably had no idea what forensic psychiatry was really all about. I like the intellectual aspect of forensic psychiatry. Forensic psychiatrists, as you said, kind of dig deeply into things and think a lot about what we know, how we can answer questions. Forensic psychiatrists think a lot about ethics, and I found that area very interesting. I also really enjoy teaching as part of my medical career, and forensic psychiatry has an interesting opportunity to be a teacher in a slightly different way. You're a teacher for the courtroom. You're helping a judge or a jury understand issues about mental illness and how they pertain to whatever the question is being asked in the courtroom.
And you're also dealing with issues of life and death. And protecting the truth, as your professor said.
Yes.
What is What does your best day, your favorite day, a great day as a forensic psychiatrist look like? Because you're dealing with dark stuff.
You're dealing with dark stuff. I think the treatment side of things can be very, very rewarding, to really work with people and help people get better and help people understand themselves, understand and kind of empower them to be able to kind of manage their own mental illness and manage their own health. So I think days where I finally get someone who's been refusing to even try medication to give it a try, those are great days. You know, the expert testimony side of things can be very exciting, and it's a great day if I feel like I've done a good job and really helped a judge understand exactly what the issues are and exactly why someone needs to stay in the hospital or is ready to move on.
And then you get to go home and watch Law and Order reruns, right?
And then you get to go home and watch Law and Order reruns, exactly.
Tara, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, it was wonderful being here.
Be sure to check out our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page for web-only clips and to keep up with everything related to Science Goes to the Movies all in one place. And if you want to watch past episodes, check us out at www.CUNY.TV under the Science tab, or try out our new YouTube channel where you'll find lots of science and movies.